Thanks for that, Scott. Scott's been a great partner from early on. You know, in 2019, Joe and Tomic's been a great partner with us, and look forward to working with you some more. It's been a good time. You know, in offering to give the keynote, it was it was all good, and then Tim Ryan Mitchell who said, you know, it's a keynote over lunch, right? And I said, oh, you know, that's tough. But he said, but don't worry, you get to eat first. I said, oh, okay, all right, I'm sold. So I'm easy that way. Now, just to make sure, you know, it would be I'd be remiss not to mention the news today of former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter's passing. So just you know, just let's all keep his family in our thoughts and prayers. Ash was certainly one of the ones that helped lay the foundation for the ability for the Department of Defense to procure and do acquisitions so quickly. So he will have a legacy that moves on, and hopefully we in the Space Development Agency, as we move forward, can continue to push that model of rapid acquisition to get the capabilities to the warfighter, which is one of the key tenets that he always advocated for. All right, now let's talk about SDA and what we've been able to do. So as Scott mentioned, you know, I took this job just a little over 3 years ago. The Space Development Agency it will be 4 years old in March. So we're actually been around, continuing to push. Now we were established outside of what was at the Air Force. There was no Space Force back then, outside of the Air Force for one reason and one reason only, and that was to come up with a completely new way to do space architecture that disrupted the status quo, the way it was currently done. And because of that, you know, we modeled ourselves and based everything off of Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which essentially says, I mention this every time I get a chance to, that you cannot have disruption from within. It really has to happen from outside. And so that's why SDA was established outside of the Air Force at the time, to come up with a completely new way of doing architecture that was going to disrupt the old method. So what was that architecture based on? It was based on two pillars, right? Pillar number one, proliferation. Replace the Battlestar Galacticas, as it's always called and referenced by General Hyten, with hundreds and hundreds of affordable proliferated satellites, doing the exact same missions, but doing it in a way that was proliferated, which gives you more persistence, more resilience, and the ability to counter out the current threats. So that's pillar number one, proliferation. Pillar number two was just as profound, and that is this spiral development concept. The idea that we are not going to take 10 years to field a constellation, 10 years to field a capability. We're going to start with a minimum viable product, and we're going to field that and increase that capability every 2 years, by hook or by crook, get those new capabilities up there. So that's what SDA was all about. So now let's talk about what that architecture actually is going to provide for the warfighter. We're providing what we call the National Defense Space Architecture. That's SDA's model of this proliferated LEO concept. And it is a weapon system. It's a weapon system that provides two main capabilities for the warfighter. Number one, beyond line of sight targeting. And number two, it's saying beyond line of sight targeting of advanced missiles in flight. So the first one is I want to be able to detect, track, and calculate a fire control solution for time-sensitive targets. Think about these as moving targets, right? So mobile missile launchers, ships, that kind of class of satellites, detect them, track them, calculate a fire control solution, and then send those data in real time directly down to a shooter that can take them out. That's mission number one. Mission number two, exact same thing, except now I'm not looking at mobile missile launchers and ships. I'm looking at advanced missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, dim upper stages, those kind of things in flight. Detect them, track them, calculate a fire control solution, and send that down to an interceptor to be able to take that out all in real time. So that's what everything's based upon. So what are we building out to make that happen? Well, the backbone, and you'll hear about this. You'll hear about this as General Grant talks about JADC2. The backbone is this transport layer, the data transport layer. Those are hundreds of satellites that are all optically connected, right, Scott? Optically connected with laser comm to allow you to have that high bandwidth, low latency communication that forms a mesh network in space. All right, that's the backbone. And now, how do you get those data to and from the actual warfighter? That's what makes it important. You actually have optical connections down to the ground, optical connections to airborne systems. Do all that in real time. And then, of course, we have hundreds of thousands of fielded radios So it would be silly to say we expect the entire Department of Defense to buy a new radio to talk to our satellites. No, that's not going to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Link 16, which is the existing model, the existing radio, to talk to all of those fielded capabilities. And that's how you'll tie all this together. Now, in addition to that, we also have KA down to be able to talk to the warfighter, as well as UHF and S-band to be able to go down. But primarily, that's how we're going to do that backbone that's going to tie it together. That's going to be the backbone for JADC2. Now, to really add some firepower to this weapon system, you need to get data. You need to get data from sensing systems onto the transport layer. So that's how we have our custody layer. Custody is, think about that as your ISR layer. We're not actually building out any of those satellites. That's the beauty of this architecture. But other folks are, right? We're working with other folks within the department and commercial who are building out sensing systems. We want to take their data in real time, get it onto the transport layer, so we can fuse that into a fire control solution and send it down to a weapon system based on those tactical data links that I mentioned. So that's the custody layer. Then we have the tracking layer. The tracking layer, that's missile tracking. We just shorten it to tracking layer. Those satellites we are building out, and we're building out those, and we're also teaming with Space Systems Command, who are building out some tracking satellites. The whole concept is we'll be able to detect and track missiles in flight, send those to the transport layer so they can be formed into a fire control solution and then sent down to a weapon system. That's the tracking layer. We also have a position navigation in time or navigation layer. And on that one, essentially what we do is you have this mesh network in space, you might as well use that to calculate a position navigation and time solution independent of GPS. And then you can send that down, over your existing tactical data links. We're not planning on broadcasting out a signal like GPS, frankly, just because our satellites are small enough to where we don't have enough power to do that. So we embed the message into our communication system. And then, of course, what I'm kind of glossing over is the magic that makes all this happen in real time. And that's the tough part. That's what we call our battle management, command and control and communication. Essentially what that means is on these satellites, I have a lot of extra processing power. When they're not actually doing one of these comm missions, they're using that processing power to fuse data, to manage the network, and to make all of this system work mostly autonomously. That's our BMC cube layer. And we have that processing capability built into the transport satellites, and the software will be acquired early next year to be able to fly as apps or massless payloads, as DARPA coined the term, on those satellites. So we're looking forward to that. All right, so that's what we're building out. Talked about the two main pillars. So now let's revisit that. Now, everything I said there sounds like magic, right? That's really difficult to make that work. And I'm not going to contend that we're going to make that work in 2 years. That's where the spiral development approach comes in. That's where we ultimately want to get to, what I just described. But the goal is we know that there's technology available that we can field within 2 years. That's what we buy, that's what we field, and we'll do that, and we'll continue to push the state of the art towards that ultimate goal, that vector that I've just outlined. Every tranche, which we call our spirals, every tranche starting from the first one and then on out. So tranche 0 is our warfighter immersion tranche, which is just for exercises. Tranche 1, that's when we can actually affect a fight. We'll have enough satellites up there to provide a real capability. Tranche 2 will have full global persistence, and then just keep spiraling until you get to that ultimate vision. This has not been an easy concept for folks within the Pentagon to grasp. All right, so in fact, when I first talk about this and I talk about, what are some of the models that this enables, not only does it enable us to get the capabilities up there more quickly, to actually get something to the fight as rapidly as possible, but it also allows us to kind of capitalize and I'll even say foment the market industry, you all primarily. So the idea is we at SDA commit to always having fair and open competition for every tranche, for every layer. So we'll have those competitions essentially every other year in perpetuity for as long as this goes on. And because of that, I expect industry to know that is a market that is stable, that you can invest into and provide offerings that will give you a competitive advantage, a differentiator, so that you can win business in the future. Because of that, I am relying on you to make those investments to make an offering. So in a sense, I am supplementing, if you will, SDA's budget with your internal research and development dollars to great products that then you can sell back to the government. So that's one of the concepts, and that's kind of tough for folks within the Pentagon to understand that that's kind of the commercial model that we're trying to push forward. The other thing that's difficult to understand is if you look at this, my timelines from contract award to launch are right around 30 months. That's what we think we can do. That's what industry is doing. But I said I'm going to launch these capabilities every 24 months. So how does that jive? Well, yes, that means that we are going to solicit and buy tranche N plus one before we have actually launched and demonstrated tranche N. And that's kind of a tough pill for a lot of folks within the department to swallow. But we now have buy-in on that, and people are agreeing that okay, that model seems to work. Especially, we've got a lot of buy-in with Dr. LaPlante in A&S that he said, "Yep, we want to continue to push forward with that kind of model. What SDA is doing in that spiral development model, it really works." So now I want to talk about the kind of the elephant in the room. So this is what SDA has done for the last 3 years, and it's been almost a month now. SDA is no longer independent of the Air Force and Space Force, and now we're rolled into the Space Force. So are we going to continue to be able to do this? And does the Space Force buy into this? It's no secret that when the SDA was 2019, 2020, when we were getting started, it's no secret that I was an advocate to say that SDA should not fold in to the mainstream space acquisition until 2025, right? I said that a lot because I said I didn't want it to happen before we launched our tranche one. At that point, I thought there would be enough of the disruption that would take hold that it would be basically irreversible. And the construction disruption, which was actually a term by Sean Barnes in the Air Force at the time, that he made that term. I said at that point in 2025, you won't be able to go back. The disruption will occur. So the question is it too early now? Are we screwed, for lack of a better term? I'm happy to say no. I actually think that in Semper Citius, always faster model, that the disruption actually occurred more quickly than anticipated. So I want to read a couple quotes of what was seen in the news in 2019. We'll call this the then, and then compare that to now. So there is no need for another agency to buy space stuff. The United States Air Force is doing pretty well at that from 2019. And in describing, obviously the quotes are unattributed to protect the guilty, but in another quote, SDA is a pet project of both acting Secretary of Defense and the Undersecretary of Defense. All right, and one that's very prescient. Launching hundreds of cheap satellites into theater will result in failure on America's worst day. All right, so that is in 2019, and those quotes, those quotes were not just taken at random. That was the prevailing thought in the traditional space acquisition enterprise at the time. And, I can't say that those quotes were unfounded, right? What we were proposing to do at SDA was clearly outside, it was clearly disruptive, and a lot of people were worried that we were basically proposing and promising too much. Now I want to read some quotes from 2022. And I really wish I would have printed this off in bigger font. But I fully support the strategy, and we will maintain their structure and culture to let them continue to do what they do best. Talking about SDA. SDA will be an integral part of the Space Force design. It will bring resiliency, accelerated capability, and delivery. Building smaller spacecraft can be done faster, so going smaller to more manageable bite-sized chunks of ground are key enablers to speed. So those are quotes, again, now those are quotes that most of those are from Assistant Secretary of Air Force Frank Cavelli, my new boss, who's really the greatest boss anyone could ever hope for. But that is not, those are not taken in a vacuum, those are not out of step with the prevailing thought. So I would say the prevailing thought now, and you'll hear about this, I'm sure you've heard this throughout the day, and you'll hear about it in panels afterwards. The prevailing thought is this is the new architecture. We have to get to this proliferated architecture. And you know what? We have to get to this faster spiral development approach. So the two pillars that I talked about in 2019, I said we're going to disrupt the current architecture and be the new one, are now embraced. So I'm happy to report that now in October of 2022, I would say that constructive disruption has occurred. And so now that is the model for the Space Force going forward is, hey, yeah, we're all in on this new model. Let's push forward. Let's make SDA a success because that is the success for the Space Force. So I would say that 2022 is not too early. 2022 is the time because now we have that capability and we've got the backing of the Space Force. So I'm proud to say that. All right, so now let's talk about some of the things that have allowed us to gain and garner that confidence from the Space Force. The first one, and this was primarily the argument back in 2019. Look, okay, you're going to take a multi-billion-dollar satellite, you're going to break it up into hundreds of satellites, got it. But those hundreds of satellites are going to cost like $100 million a piece. Multiply that by 100, you're 10 times more expensive than the way we do it now. We just can't afford it. It's ridiculous. I said, no. I said, I just came from industry. My experience in industry says that we can probably do this for about $20, $25 million a satellite. So you multiply that by 100. And while we're not cheaper, we're comparable to the same cost of the Battlestar Galacticas. And we've got this proliferation, so that's a better deal. Turns out that in Tranche 0 for the transport satellites, average price, $14 million. It was $14.1 million was our price of those. So it came in below what I thought. So that got a lot of people confidence. On Tranche 1, it actually came in just under $14 million, and we increased the capability of each individual satellite from Tranche 0 to Tranche 1. So that says that, wow, this model of piggybacking off of what is commoditized by industry and allowing, as long as we're not trying to push ahead of what they can develop, we can really come in at affordable price points to get us these capabilities at the same comparable cost as we would spend on a single large Battlestar Galactica. So that's data point number one. Now, data point number two was, okay, look, you can do it cheap, fine, good. But you can't do it that fast, right? I mean, you're silly. Actually, we have demonstrated that we've been able to do the acquisitions right at about 100 days from acquisition hitting the street to contract award. That's a metric we track. We're pretty proud of that, about 100 days. In fact, another metric that's just as important and critical is we're about 200 days from snapping the chalk line to say this is the minimum viable product for what we need to launch on a given tranche to when those contracts are awarded. That's right at 200 days. If you look historically across DoD, those numbers are measured in multiple years, on the order of 5-7 years from snapping the chalk line to a capability on contract. And then we're pushing just as fast to get to launch. We'll have our first launch of our Tranche 0. We had in 2021, we had some experiments and demos launches. By the end of this year, we'll have our first launch of Tranche 0. And then in March, we'll have the full Tranche 0 constellation up just in time for Northern Edge exercises so we can demonstrate that capability. So that's what has given people confidence that, okay, maybe there's something to this. Let's let it go and we'll embrace it. Now, how have we been able to do that? Well, we're actually using all of the same rules. We're following the law, right? I'm not in jail yet. And so we're moving forward on that, right? Got my general counsel there that's keeping me out of jail. So, but we do contracting a little differently. What I mean by that is, we started out using FAR-based contracts, and we showed that you could go just as fast with FAR-based contracts. There's no magic between FAR-based or another transaction agreement. However, not all pieces and parts of industry and the government were able to move as quickly and be as flexible with the FAR-based contracting. So we switched to other transaction agreements for Tranche 1, and that's worked out really well. But that's not really what I would say is our difference in contracting, right? A lot of people can use those. Those are just different tools, but they all work. What's different is that we're committing to do full and open competition for every tranche at every layer. And that's important because we want folks within the department and folks in industry to realize this is a market. Don't think about each of these as discrete programs. Sure, we're acquiring them as discrete programs because that's the system we live in. But realistically, it's a market. And you can anticipate as you're building out your business case to win a certain fraction of that market. Don't put it together as win or lose on a given program because these acquisitions will happen essentially every year. We're going out with new acquisitions. And that's a different model because typically the department has been forced into this. We're going to do a very long, protracted acquisition. And then from that point on, we're going to either down select or we're going to just continue to sole source an ECP in perpetuity for at least a long time. And we say, no, we're not going to do that. For one thing, that's better for the government because it allows us to have this competition. It's better for you all because you can plan to more of a commoditized commercial market segment than discrete programs. And everyone knows that just because you win one, you're not locked in forever. If you lose one, you're not locked out forever. And that helps on both sides. So that's what I mean when I say we do contracting differently. Now, we also do our actual acquisition approach differently in what we incentivize. We truly incentivize schedule number one, cost number two, and performance number three. We will trade cost and performance to make sure we maintain schedule. The spiral development approach only works if you can keep that kind of model of delivering these capabilities on time. Obviously, as the warfighter is concerned, the better product that's sitting on the ground when you go to war is not helpful. So that's our unofficial motto. Our official motto is semper citius, always faster. Unofficial, better is the enemy of good enough. You've got to get the capabilities up there in time. So that's what we prioritize, and we do it all firm fixed price contracting. The only cost plus contract we have is on our operations and integration contract. But everything else, all of our space vehicle, all of our hardware, firm fixed price, because we don't want to do tech development. Now, obviously, there is tech development somewhat, but we don't want to try to push the limit on that because that's just going to increase your schedule, and schedule's number one. All right, so what does that lead us to? That leads us to a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of time. So it is, look, I've been in industry. I was in industry for 7 years. I know how difficult it is to respond to these acquisitions and go at this speed. Trust me, we're doing the same thing. We're getting these acquisitions out to you on time and keeping this essentially continuous acquisition approach. We're just coming up on our CDRs for tranche one, coming up shortly. And just around the corner, right, next summer, you can expect the solicitations coming out for tranche two transport. Next fall, tranche two tracking. So that's how quickly these things happen. In fact, we're going to, we just awarded Tides and the next contract. So we went just from that award to planning for our next acquisition. So you can look forward to that. And we'll keep up that, my promise to industry is we'll keep up that pace. We'll keep that market open and pushing forward. You have my commitment, and you also have the commitment within the whole Department of Defense. If you look at the Space Force's budget on where they're putting their money and where they're investing. They're investing in SDA's model to be able to get these capabilities to the warfighter. So you have our commitment that we'll do that. We'll do everything in our power possible to push that forward. We need your commitment to keep continually investing to make sure that we have good capabilities, that we can have these competitions, and that we can deliver on time and get these capabilities to the warfighter. So another data point, now this has actually been highlighted a lot recently, that shows that the disruption is occurring is if you look at the entire missile warning, missile tracking, missile defense architecture that the Space Force is now calling out in their force design structure, right? So they have embraced this whole model of getting away from the Battlestar Galacticas and going into more proliferated architectures. And more importantly than that, not only the proliferated architectures, but the spiral development. So, this is, I like to talk about this because it highlights the disruption. So obviously we used to have the Battlestar Galacticas in GEO and in HEO, providing the critical capability for missile warning to the nation. We'll continue to have those as those satellites are up there. We're in acquisition. The Space Force is in acquisition to put some more of those up. But that's not the future. And the Space Force has come out and said, the future is this proliferated system. We're going to have the proliferated LEO that SDA is so proud of and we're developing and delivering. And then the proliferated, semi-proliferated, because you don't need as many, but semi-proliferated at MEO, the Space Systems Command is fielding. Now here, so that's pillar number one, proliferation, bought into it. Okay. Now pillar number two, spiral development. Are they really bought into spiral development? So our spirals are called tranches, right? We have tranche 0 launching in a few weeks, first launch, a few months, second launch. And then in 24, we start the launches for tranche 1 operational system. SSC doing the same thing for the MEO systems. They're doing spiral development approaches. I can't call them tranches because that'd be silly, but they're calling them epochs, right? So they have epoch 1, epoch 2, and continuing on. And so that shows that, hey, they've actually bought into this spiral development approach too. And it actually is a good vernacular. You'll hear people talk about tranches, that means Leo, epochs, that means Meo, and essentially they're phased, they're both on 2-year centers, but the Meo ones are basically phased a year behind the Leo ones. So you've got tranche 1, epoch 1, tranche 2, epoch 2, in perpetuity until we get these constellations up there and delivering to the warfighter. So that is just another data point on how we're able to push this disruption through the department, and it's been accepted. Now, how do we make sure that we continue to do this and we don't just get into this vendor lock situation and we essentially slide back into the old way of doing business? The biggest thing we can do as acquirers is make sure that we promote interoperability. So from SDA's perspective, there's 2 things that we need to enforce to make sure that all satellite systems that we buy and acquire and field in the future can plug and play into the infrastructure. And that is, we have to have a networking standard, which we've defined. That's actually based on an NRL-based concept for their networking in space. They call it Nebula. Networking above the limits of the Earth's atmosphere, or beyond the upper limits of the atmosphere, nebula. Yeah. So that's the networking. And then the second one is the optical communication standards, right? Now that I can network, I also have to make sure that my walkie-talkie talks to the other walkie-talkie. You don't want to be the only kid on the block with the walkie-talkie. So we have an optical communication standard that we published that anyone can build to. If you build to that standard, you know you can plug into our network. We actually have, with NRL, we have developed a test lab so that folks can bring their optical terminals to NRL to demonstrate that they can plug and play with our optical standard as well as other vendors' optical communication terminals to make sure there is no vendor lock situation and it's all interoperable. We know that other optical comm terminal providers have been building out their own interoperability stations, and they're welcoming their competimates to bring their terminals in so they can make sure they demonstrate interoperability. That's all goodness, right? That shows that we have this open architecture. We can, as long as we can put things in a packetized format, we can network it with the Nebula standard. As long as we build to an optical standard, we can talk to one another and make sure we plug and play. That's another promise that SDA is making to make sure that industry feels comfortable that we're not going to get in this vendor lock situation. It's good for the department. I think it's good for industry. It allows you to feel comfortable to invest in these capabilities. Now, that's not to say that if you want to plug in, if someone is going to plug into the SDA transport layer, that's not the only way to do it, right? We also have this concept of translator sats. So you have some of the commercial networks up there and some of the commercial ISR data providers. They may not have either the capability or the ability to put an optical comm terminal that matches the SDA transport layer, or frankly, they may not be able to meet the Nebula standard because of crypto requirements and things like that, which is not an easy thing to solve. That's one of the things we're working through. In that case, we're building out and we're working with partners to build out translator sats. That's my term. I'm no better than NRL when it comes to naming things. But translator sat is a satellite that will be able to basically talk to the SDA transport layer and talk to either the commercial or other government agency providers layer so that we can do that translation to move data from one network onto the other. And there's a lot of reasons you may need to do that, but that's that while not the preferred, that's another option that we have available to be able to use the SDA transport layer, again, to tie this whole mission together. Whole mission, in a nutshell, is to get the right sensor data to the right shooter at the right time, and that's how we enable that. So, now just in closing, the way ahead, I think, is to continue to keep pushing forward as we have been. We've certainly got enough backing within the Space Force and the Air Force at large, right? I could not ask for a better leadership team at this time to be able to give the support that SDA needs to push forward. So it's all on us to be able to continue to push this. It's on industry to be able to continue to deliver as you propose, and then we'll keep pushing forward. So I think that SDA is leading the way, but we're certainly in lockstep now with the Space Force model. And so this is the force design of the future. So Semper Citius, thank you all for coming out. Thank you, for this beautiful venue and hosting us, and thanks for lunch, Tim. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yes, please state your name and where you're from, date of birth, blood type, credit card number.
Eric Hernandez-Becerra from Raytheon. The way that you are buying has been very visible, how that changed the market demand, the approach for contracting, getting contracts started pretty quickly. Have you seen also a change in the way you're managing the execution of those contracts that you can share in terms of lessons learned from going to these spiral rapid acquisition pieces? And do you see a difference between what's required to get the satellite tranches delivered versus something like the BMC3 architecture, which is going to require much more integration?
So right now, the two major programs we have, Tranche 0 and Tranche 1, the overall construct of how we're doing our acquisition and that model is the same between those two tranches. But I will say that the culture of how the actual acquisition is being managed is a little different between the two. Tranche 0 is much more, we're doing this fast. It really has the minimum viable product for Tranche 0 is provide 2 capstone demonstrations. One, to show data that we can move from a targeting cell down to a Link 16 network. And then number 2 is show that we can detect and track a hypersonic glide vehicle in test and move that down a Link 16 network. That's it. Once we demonstrate that, we declare success, and everything else on top of that as far as providing these exercises, all of that is above and beyond what was the minimum viable product. So that took a very aggressive approach to getting Tranche 0 up and going, because that's the minimum viable product. Tranche 1 is much different. The minimum viable product for Tranche 1 is actually more specifically defined as being able to provide a certain level of detection thresholds and coverage for the missile warning, missile tracking, have a certain latency to the warfighter, and be able to provide coverage for Link 16 networks over a certain fraction of the globe as an operational system. So I'll say the risk posture for Tranche 1, while it is still prioritizing schedule, then cost, and performance, is a much higher risk, much lower risk tolerance than on Tranche 0. So what that means is we do have more rigor in our reviews and things like that in Tranche 1 than Tranche 0. In addition to that, because of the fact that the department is spending and investing so much more money in Tranche 1, they're requiring a lot more oversight, and so we have to kind of do that. So that's a long way to answer your question, but I would say the answer is the basic philosophy of the way we're going to do contract management is the same, and it will continue to be the same Tranche 0, 1, 2, N+1. But I will say the amount of rigor that we're putting into the reviews and things like that have increased primarily because of the additional oversight. But we're making sure that we keep to that schedule first, then cost, and then performance. Is this Sandra in the back? Sandra Irwin from Space News, everyone. Let's give her a round of applause. There you go, Sandra.
Thank you, Derek. I wanted to ask you about what you've been making of what's been going on in Ukraine with the commercial LEO system that seems to be operating really well, but then you hear these bluster from Russia that we're going to shoot it down. We have thousands of missiles, we can take it down. And China apparently also has talked about the problem that they have with this kind of system. So have you drawn any conclusions or maybe thoughts about when you have a transport layer in low Earth orbit, what threats you may face and how you would be able to survive through these kinds of contested situations? Thank you.
Sure. So obviously, operational system resiliency for the Department of Defense is a key critical performance parameter. We get our resiliency through proliferation, right? We expect to be able to absorb a certain amount of attrition. And you say, well, how much attrition? Well, just if you want to look at the math really quickly, just a rule of thumb, 5-year satellite lifetimes. So that means you're going to be roughly replacing your satellites 20% a year. Obviously, we do it in chunks, but roughly 20% a year. So you kind of expect that level of attrition to be able to operate through without any degradation of capabilities once you're fully operational. So that's kind of a rough order, of what we expect to take for attrition. So that's what we base the resiliency off of, is proliferation. Now, obviously, there are threats to our systems that we have some mitigating effects on, especially like protecting focal planes and things like that. We kind of make sure that those systems are in place, but primarily it's over proliferation. The specific questions, the blusters, I lose track. How many satellites? How many Starlink satellites have the Russians shot down so far? I can't remember what. Carrier 1, 0, 0. So just throwing that out there. Now, obviously, we know they demonstrated some capabilities, but just putting that out there. Yes. What is it?
Hi, Teresa Hitchens, Breaking Defense. Nice to see you. Could you elaborate a little on the translator satellite concept? Are you talking about a payload? And you said you're working with partners, and can you give a time frame? I assume that this is not just for data transport, but it's also to link the custody layer partners into the system, because they obviously they're up there already and they're using their own data standards and things like that. So could you just elaborate on that?
Right. So you're right. It is. This is one of the main ways that we will get the custody data onto our transport layer, because if a lot of these commercial providers, I don't have permission from some of the commercial ISR providers to talk about activities, so I don't want to get out ahead of them. But obviously, we do have a contract with Capella to demonstrate that they can do. Now that they're not using a translator satellite for what we're doing with Capella, we're putting an actual optical comm terminal that is compatible with our OCT standard on their satellite to be able to demonstrate that we can do it that way. So that's a little different. But for the satellites satellite networks that are already up there, and they have their own, we'll call it, for lack of a better term, their own transport layer to move their data around, likely it would be either a payload on one of their satellites or a payload on one of our satellites that we fly that does the translation. And so what does that look like? So what it looks like, obviously there's the easy part, and that's the actual optical comm terminal that you can plug. There's many vendors out there that are providing terminals that meet our optical standard. So a third-party vendor could buy that, put that on their transport layer, and that could that's part of what you need to be the translator sat. That's necessary but not sufficient. The second thing you need is a nebulizer and a denebulizer. I know. Can't believe I said that out loud. But anyway, so that's right. So you have to take whatever networking protocols that are used on the third-party translator network, or third-party vendor network, put that into a nebula standard format that can be injected into the SDA transport layer network. And that is something that SDA is developing. We're developing generic, we'll call it software development toolkits for the nebulizer and the denebulizer that then third-party vendors could take, and they could use that as a starting point then to integrate that in with their system. So those are the two hard technical challenges to enable the translator sats. And then the third one is, okay, now we need to make sure we work out a proper cybersecurity framework to allow us to take data on and off the network. But that's something that has a lot of different types of solutions based on whether those data are coming from a different government system, a commercial system, a contractor operated but government owned commercial system, things like that. But basically, those are the parts that need to happen. Oh, the time frame. So we want these to be. We're planning on having some of these operational with the tranche 1, so in the 24-25 timeframe, and then we expect in tranche 2 we have the same thing. We have tides on tranche 1. We have tudes on Tranche 2, I know, just. So anyway, the demonstration and experiment, Tranche 2, demonstration and experimentation satellites, likely, this isn't set in stone, but likely some of those satellites would be demonstrators of different translator sats for different constellations. So those would be in your 26 timeframe.
Thank you. Jason Brown, Missile Defense Agency. Probably a Tranche 1 question, but interested in your vision on the command and control. This will be the largest DoD constellation when fielded. What are your thoughts on that?
So our command and control is going to be done from 2 ops centers, one at Grand Forks Air Force Base and the other one at Redstone Arsenal. We're doing this as part of a government-owned contractor-operated construct. We have an operation and integration contractor, General Dynamics, teamed with Iridium, that's basically building out those ops centers and are going to man those, to be able to staff those, to be able to make sure that those are operational. There's 3 parts of an ops center. There's the satellite ops, and so that's just care and feeding of the satellite, collision avoidance, that kind of thing. Those will usually be done, especially starting out, will be done by the space vehicle vendor, and then that will transition over to the O&I vendor. So that's part 1. That will always be contractor operated. And then the second part is your network operations. So you have this mesh network in space, right? And so essentially now you're just an IT operator to make sure that that network is operating and everything's connecting. That is also going to be contractor operated. That's part of General Dynamics' job to be able to do that as part of the O&I contractor. And then the third part of an operational system is the mission ops side. And essentially that means that's the one that would make priority calls on whether this network gets more utilization, more bandwidth at a given time than this one. If there's any mission planning, if you have strike packages or things like that that you have to plan around. So those individuals have to work very closely with the individual combatant commands, likely through Space Command as the regional combatant command for space, to make sure that those operations are properly planned. That will be done by folks from the Space Force in an operational role.
Afternoon, Derek Barrett Tilton from Maxar. Now that you've survived the infant mortality process of creating the acquisition alternative agile scheme that you're working on, do you see that as continuing to function sort of as an alternative path down the road, or is there a point where the agile acquisition, what you're doing right now, would become more the mainstream way of getting space capability and move forward going that way?
So all I can say is there are a lot of eyes on us within the Space Force and within the department at large on whether or not this spiral model works for space acquisition. And the reason there are so many eyes on us is because it is being used as essentially a pathfinder for how we should do future space acquisitions. If we were just doing this as part of a demo prototype, we would have a lot less scrutiny. But people know that this is the model going forward. If this is successful, then this will be the pathfinder for how we do the majority of our space acquisitions. All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. Can't see back in that corner, so if there's anybody back, back there.
Hi, Stephanie Del Pozo, Mergers and Acquisition Advisory at NextFed. I just have a question on how you plan to interact with other agencies and organizations within Space Force or broader DoD, and to support a really robust ecosystem of independent OEMs that don't exist under larger industry titans to ensure that you stay on schedule.
So we're working, as I mentioned, especially if you look at the custody layer. So it's not SDA's intention to build those satellites themselves out, but to work with other mission partners. And a lot of those are within the DoD, other agencies within the Department of Defense, to build out those specific constellations that would plug into our transport layer. As far as a broader reach outside of the traditional OEMs, if you will, and the traditional primes, what I commit to is full and open competition, every layer, every tranche going forward. And we don't we don't put any preferential treatment on the large primes. If you look at York Space Systems on our Tranche 0 and Tranche 1, in fact, they won tides as well. Small company that's actually done very well. They were, I'll be honest, I was skeptical in Tranche 0 when we selected them, but we went with them and they've been doing well. So we welcome that competition, and we try to allow the market to kind of respond and provide the best of breed. All right, one other question. Anybody else? I can't see in that corner or that corner. So if there's anybody in there. Okay.
Derek, hi. Jacob Markish at Thales USA. Question about China, mentioned earlier as the obvious adversary and threat. I think there's a data point of 260 ISR satellites fielded by them. How would you compare that capability that's maybe already on orbit to what we're doing at SDA? I mean, should we think of China as having already done something comparable to what we're doing with within DSA? Or how should we think about that capability?
So if you look at China's space architecture, they clearly have embraced a more they've embraced those pillars, proliferation and spiral development before we have, and that's kind of their model going forward, and they've used that. And so what the only thing I can say about that is they also didn't have all of the legacy that had given them the exquisite capabilities up to date. So they kind of started with a cleaner slate and were able to do that based on the technology at the time. That's what drove us to decide on that technology, that architecture, and it also drove them that way. So I would say that I'm not going to comment on whether they have better capabilities than we do or worse capabilities than we do. I'm not gonna comment on that. But I will say that it's clear that they're following more of the proliferation and more of the faster development timelines than the U.S. has historically done. All right.
Greg, thanks so much. Can I take the privilege of asking you one more question?
Sure, absolutely.
Please. One thing, understand you're going to set standards so that people can compete and plug into these architectures, which is wonderful. I think one of the questions maybe in the minds of the providers is who owns the intellectual property of the payload, and what will drive the advancement and miniaturization of communications for smaller payloads or ISR capabilities. So what's your philosophy on that going forward?
Sure. No. So the model we use is that if you, to a certain extent, and I'll qualify this in a second, but if you can plug into our networking standard and our optical comm standard, I don't care too much about the black box inside of that. So if you want to protect that with as much IP as possible, I don't care. That can be commercial IP as long as you meet the open standard, then that's okay. Now I said I was going to qualify that a little bit, right? So we have to make sure that we have enough understanding of what's inside that black box, that there's not vulnerabilities. So we have some specific activities in place that we do during acquisition to test for those. And then, of course, we need to make sure that it meets our quality when it comes to especially the missile warning, missile tracking, that it meets the sensitivity and the field of view and things like that. But otherwise, that can be the intellectual property of the company, and they can own that. We'll own the standards and make sure there's interoperability.
Terrific. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Derek, really appreciated that enthusiastic presentation, and we wish you all the best on Tranche 0. Look forward to seeing it on orbit, and then we'd like to have you come back to Mitchell Space and tell us how it's going once it's up and flying. So good luck to you.